I'm Dan Murrell, and I have my review of Last Night in Soho, which I saw tonight in Arkansas. Hello everybody, and welcome to my review for Last Night in Soho, the latest film from Edgar Wright, who is one of my favorites, if not my favorite working director. I've got the Shaun of the Dead shirt on today. I've got, by the way, this is probably the most asked about thing over my shoulder here on the set, this cricket bat, it's signed, if you can see, by Simon Pegg, because Shaun uses a cricket bat in Shaun of the Dead. I've been a big fan of Edgar Wright's work ever since I saw Shaun of the Dead back when it came out. This was when people asked me, 2021, what is your most anticipated movie of the year? For me, it was Last Night in Soho. Edgar Wright directs, of course. He also shares screenplay credit with Krysty Wilson-Cairns, who is coming off an Oscar nomination for 1917. A quick note before we get into the review, as I've mentioned for the past couple weeks, I started an audio channel, so there's now a Dan Murrell podcast, which includes the audio for everything that I do here on YouTube, but there are also going to be some audio exclusives. I put out an audio exclusive review of The Last Duel a couple of weeks ago. If you check the audio channel now, you will also find an audio exclusive review of the film Antlers, which is hitting theaters here domestically this weekend. I think that the worldwide rollout, it kind of depends on where you are. It is produced by Guillermo del Toro. It is sort of a creature feature horror film, but there's more to it than you might think on the surface, and it was a very interesting film to get into. So if you want to hear that review, you can check the description below. There's links to Apple Music, Spotify, Audible, wherever you like to hear podcasts. You can find that link down there and hear what I thought of the film Antlers. Last Night in Soho stars Thomasin McKenzie, who plays Eloise, a young girl with the ability to see spirits who moves to London to be a fashion student. Seeking escape from the dorm life, she rents a flat, but soon finds that she isn't the only resident. At night, she's transported into the life of Sandy, who's played by Anya Taylor-Joy. Sandy is another young woman with big dreams who's living in 1960s London, and the two girls run on parallel tracks as we see the difficulties they both face, with Sandy's life eventually being run by Jack, played by Matt Smith, who looms menacingly over the entire movie. Sandy and Eloise's lives begin to merge, and Eloise finds herself at the center of a deadly mystery as she tries to convince everyone around her that she's not imagining her horrible visions. The cast also includes Terrence Stamp as a mysterious stranger, and Dame Diana Rigg, who sadly passed away last fall, as Eloise's landlady, who may hold clues to her flat's mysterious past.
No male visitors after 8 o'clock.
Not a problem.
And no using the laundry room at night.
Edgar Wright is a director who has never been shy about the people who influence him and influence the movies that he makes, and Last Night in Soho is very reminiscent of a 1970s psychological thriller. There is a heavy dose of Brian De Palma. You also get some Dario Argento thrown in there. There's some Nicholas Roeg. There's a splash of Alfred Hitchcock as well. The movie actually reminded me quite a bit of a film that I didn't see until this year. It was a movie that came out in 1978 called Eyes of Laura Mars, which was co-written by John Carpenter. It was directed by Irvin Kershner, who did The Empire Strikes Back and many other films, it's a pretty nifty little thriller, by the way. It stars Faye Dunaway and Tommy Lee Jones if you haven't seen it. But that 1970s vibe, that 1970s influence is not just under the surface, it's on the surface. And like I said, Edgar Wright is not trying to hide the fact that he is walking in the footsteps of a lot of talented filmmakers while bringing his own unique talents to the kinds of films that they've made. Edgar Wright continues to grow as a filmmaker, and I would say that of all of his films, Last Night in Soho is the least like anything else that he's done before. We see a lot of different flavors from him. He dials down a lot of the things that he's done in so many other films, even ones as varied as Scott Pilgrim vs. the World and Baby Driver. He's also, of course, an incredibly talented filmmaker, and he is full of passion and creativity in a way that makes his movies leap off the screen. But I do think it gets a little lost in the 1970s influences in this film. This is a very tense story, but it's also one that I think goes on a little bit too long, particularly in the second act. Once we sort of establish what's going on, we keep jumping back and forth between these timelines long past the point where it's been established who the different characters are, what the dynamic is, and I think it's because Wright so loves that aesthetic, and it is a very lush feel. It's not like he's putting things on screen that are uninteresting. It's just that narratively, I think we reach a point where the second act of this movie drags on too long, so that by contrast, when we we get to the third act and we get a little bit more conventional, it stands out just that much more from the rest of the film. However, there's a depth to the story here that keeps the film from capsizing in the middle, as it could have if it was more of a surface level ghost story. And that's because we see this story almost exclusively through the points of view of the two female protagonists, which is something that we don't often see even in movies about women. Yes, this is a ghost story, but this is also a story about young women trying to navigate the dark, murky underside of London, where there are much scarier things lurking in the shadows than ghosts and goblins. This movie is about those things as well. It's about a city that chews up and spits out young girls on a nightly basis. And the merging of these two stories is really what keeps the interest flowing throughout the film, even as it wanders a little bit in the middle. It's actually somewhat of a coincidence that this is Edgar Wright's sixth narrative film. He also has done documentaries and shorts, but if we're talking narrative film, this is number 6 for him because it goes back to a parallel filmmaker, somebody that I know Edgar Wright is friends with and draws influences from and trusts his opinion on, Quentin Tarantino. When you go back to Tarantino's filmography, Death Proof, back in the times before Kill Bill was retroactively combined into one movie, Death Proof was Tarantino's 6th film. It was part of the Grindhouse double feature and then it was released on its own. But I was always not a big fan of Death Proof because I shared some of the concerns that I have with Last Night in Soho. I felt that Death Proof got so wrapped up in what it was paying homage to that it forgot to be a movie in its own right. Now, I like Last Night in Soho more than I liked Death Proof, but I think it shares a common quality in that we have a filmmaker here with Edgar Wright who's had great past success, has earned the right really to do almost anything he pleases, but is still searching for the correct formula as a filmmaker to figure out what is the correct balance of paying homage to something or making something that kind of emulates another thing and something that can stand on its own two legs. Now, it should be noted that in my opinion, directly after Death Proof, Quentin Tarantino started making some of, if not the best films in his career. Inglourious Basterds, Django Unchained, The Hateful Eight, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I love all of those movies, and they were all born out of this period for Tarantino where he was perfecting that formula. So if Edgar Wright's career is going to follow the same trajectory, and he's about to enter a renaissance period as a filmmaker, if Last Night in Soho is the film where he's sort of wandering and trying to figure out the formula, then we're in pretty good shape as filmgoers because this is not a bad movie. This just isn't a great one. The one thing that is great about this movie is the look, the feel, the lushness of the different time periods. And of course, a lot of credit goes to Edgar Wright on that, but a lot of credit also goes to the cinematographer of the film, Chung-Hoon Chung, who worked on several movies with Park Chan-wook. He also shot 2017's It. He gives us the visual cues to represent the duality of these two time periods, and yet also is able to tie them together into one unifying vision for the film. There's also a lot of cool wizardry where we're switching characters between Anya Taylor-Joy and Thomasin McKenzie. My suspicion is that a lot of that was practical, that it was done in camera, which of course he would have had a lot to do with. This is one of the things that makes this movie so interesting to watch beyond just the story unfolding on screen. The performances are likewise solid, although I do think that Thomasin McKenzie as the lead could have dialed back on the vulnerability just a little bit. Her character is very vulnerable, but I thought that that note was kind of overplayed from time to time in the film. This is apparently the last performance from Dame Diana Rigg, her final role. She lends the film an elegance that she brought to all of her roles, but also this sort of bemused mystery that she has also been able to bring to a lot of her different characters. If you're going to go out, I say go out on top, and this is a great role to remember Dame Diana Rigg's legacy. I think that Terrence Stamp and Matt Smith kind of get the shorter ends of the stick, particularly Matt Smith, who is good in this role, but it's also kind of a one-note role, and that's because you really have this great dual performance at the center of the film. So much of the movie is given to them that there's not a whole lot else for some of the other folks to do, and particularly when you have an actor like Terrence Stamp. I did get to the end of the movie, while it is an important role, I felt like I wish he could have had a little bit more business, a little bit more to do, but that's just the nature of a movie like this. Who knows what was cut out? And when you have so many different characters and you're jumping between different timelines and different stories, some things are going to get shoved to the margins, and I think that Terrence Stamp and Matt Smith were those things in this film. Overall, I think that Last Night in Soho is an interesting addition to Edgar Wright's filmography, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that it is one of his best films. However, I would also note that I don't think of the 6 movies that Edgar Wright's made, any of his films have even approached being bad films. So coming in near the bottom of a filmography that is full of good films isn't such a bad thing if you ask me. And I think most importantly, he's not regressing as a director. I don't really see any signs that he is phoning anything in or even trying to find a pattern for himself. He keeps trying to challenge himself with new genres, with new filmmaking techniques. Every Edgar Wright film is interesting in its own right, no pun intended, and this film is no different, although he has experimented with the horror genre. Shaun of the Dead, even parts of Hot Fuzz were very representative of what you would see in a typical horror film. This is a horror mystery, and I like that this is a new flavor of stuff. 6 films in, and 15 years into his feature filmmaking career, 15 plus years, Edgar Wright is still rethinking things and innovating and challenging himself, and that's what I like to see. Even if a movie doesn't succeed to great heights, I love that he is still a director that's taking chances and saying, I'm going to do something that I've never done before, because you can tell it's interesting for him as a filmmaker, and it's certainly interesting for me as an audience member. I am an unapologetic Edgar Wright stan. I always have been, and I probably will be for quite some time. So if I can go into a movie, especially a movie that's been delayed and delayed and delayed, like Last Night in Soho, and come out saying, you know what, that was an interesting film. I saw something new from one of my favorite directors, if not my favorite working director, I'm going to consider that a win. And I think for people that are fans of Edgar Wright's work, they may think the same as well. So that is a recommendation for me on Last Night in Soho. But what do you think? It's in theaters now, finally here domestically, and I think it's also rolling out in a lot of markets around the world, including the UK. Let me know what you think down in the comments below, and don't forget to check the description for the audio links so you can check out my audio exclusive review of Antlers. Also, if you want to see what else I'm up to, you can check me out on Patreon at patreon.com/Dan Murrell. But most importantly, thank you for joining me here on the channel. I'll be back soon with more news, reviews, charts, you name it. I love talking about it. I love movies. Thanks for joining me on this one, and I'll see you next time. Bye.